At 9:40 on a cold Tuesday night, Tristan Castellano lay perfectly still on the leather sofa in his study, pretending to be asleep. He was 38 years old, a feared Mafia boss who owned half the container yards in Brooklyn. And for 6 months, a traitor inside his own house had been bleeding him dry. So he laid out a deadly trap. Fake numbers, thousands of dollars left open, and a poisoned glass placed right beside his motionless fingers as he waited to catch a killer red-handed. But 40 minutes later, the door opened a second time, and the poor housekeeper who walked in wasn't part of anyone's plan. Delilah Whitfield was 27, a live-in housekeeper who took the job solely to pay for her mother's dialysis bills. In a house of 32 employees, nobody even knew her name. She didn't touch the money, but looking at the motionless man on the chair, she did the one thing not a single person in that house had dared to do to the Mafia boss in 15 years, setting off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. If a story like this one moves you, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who could use a little warmth tonight, subscribe so you won't miss a new story from us, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. And now, let's get on with today's story. 6 months before the night he lay motionless in that leather chair, Tristan Castellano still believed his home was the safest place in the world. He was 38 years old. He had taken control of the family at 23, during a week when no one on the council believed he would last 3 months, and 15 years later, no one ever mentioned that prediction again. The estate stood in Oyster Bay, an hour and a half by car from the Red Hook container terminal when traffic was light. 3 transportation companies operated under 3 different names, paid every dollar of their taxes, kept separate accountants, underwent annual audits, and all 3 ultimately flowed into the same hand. In Brooklyn, people didn't say his name loudly inside restaurants. They lowered their voices halfway, as though the name itself had ears. Then, that spring, something began to leak. The first time, it was a shipment of 42 containers. It hadn't even made it out of the terminal before it was stopped at the security gate. Every document was in order, yet the shipment was still held for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in that business meant a sum of money no one wanted to say aloud. The second time was worse. A private meeting on the 2nd floor of a laundromat in Bensonhurst. Only 4 people knew the location, and 4 minutes after the meeting began, men from the Rinaldi family were already standing at the bottom of the stairs. 4 minutes, not 40 minutes, which meant someone had made the call before the door had even finished closing. The third time was the one that made Tristan sit perfectly still for a very long time in his office. There was one name that only 4 people in the entire organization knew. A name buried at the bottom of everything. And one August morning it suddenly came out of the mouth of a third-rate informant in Sunset Park, a man who sold scraps of information in exchange for rent money. The man didn't even understand what he'd just said. Tristan opened 3 internal investigations. The first examined every entry and exit log from the terminal for the previous 9 months, comparing every shift, every access card, every signature, nothing. The second reviewed 27 bank accounts belonging to people with access, looking for an unfamiliar payment, an unexplained trip, a new car, nothing. The third investigation was the most expensive and the most useless. He hired a private security firm in Manhattan, men who had once worked for the government, and they returned a 40-page report concluding that the leak wasn't coming from the system. Tristan read all 40 pages in a single evening, folded the report shut, and said nothing. He didn't shout at anyone. He'd never shouted at anyone. People in the organization feared him not because he raised his voice, but because he never did, and because anything he said once never needed to be said a second time. During those 6 months, there were 3 men closest to him, and he looked at all 3 of them every day. Vincent Graziano, 62 years old, had been the estate's butler for 24 years, the man who opened the door for him every morning, and the only person in the house permitted to enter his office without knocking. Vincent was the man who had once stood behind a 14-year-old Tristan in front of a mirror and taught him how to tie a necktie, twice, until the knot sat perfectly straight. Adrian Sabatini, 41 years old, had been his second in command for 12 years, the man who sat at Tristan's right hand in every meeting and the only one who dared to say, "You're wrong," right in the middle of a council session. 7 years earlier in Newark, Adrian had pulled Tristan down and taken a bullet clean through the shoulder. He spent 3 weeks in the hospital and refused morphine because he said he needed to stay awake in case they came back. Leo Barone, 45 years old, was the head of security, a man who had once driven for Tristan's father and now drove for him. The man who opened the car door and then stepped back exactly one pace, never reaching out a hand to steady him. Those 3 men had held Tristan's life in their hands so many times that he'd stopped counting. On the final night of the 6th month, Tristan sat alone until dawn was almost breaking, and he forced himself to reach the conclusion he'd spent half a year avoiding. The leak wasn't coming from the docks. It wasn't coming from the lawyers, the accountants, or anyone on the outer circle. 4 minutes at the laundromat could only have come from someone who knew his schedule in advance. The name in Sunset Park could only have come from one of 4 people. The traitor wasn't somewhere outside the city. The traitor slept beneath the same roof as he did, walked the same hallways, heard coffee being poured in the morning, knew exactly where he sat at 10 o'clock at night, which meant the traitor wore a face he loved. He had reached exactly the same conclusion once before, 15 years earlier, and that time he had arrived 3 weeks too late. It was raining that night. Warehouse number 4 at the Red Hook terminal had a small meeting room on the mezzanine, and his father sat there with 3 other men until nearly midnight. Salvatore Castellano was 59 years old and had never spent a single day in a hospital in his life. That very morning, he had walked 2.5 miles along the waterfront, just as he had done for 20 years. By the time Tristan reached the room, his father was sitting back against the chair, his head tilted slightly to one side, and on the table in front of him stood a glass that was still half full. Tristan was 23. He dropped to his knees. His father's hand seized the collar of his shirt, hard at first, then slowly loosened. He managed to say only one sentence, not an instruction about the family, not a name, but something so brief that Tristan had to lean close to hear it clearly. Never owe anyone a second time, Tristan. And then there was nothing more. Dr. Owen Price arrived 20 minutes later. He had been the family's private physician even then, a man who had spent his entire life never asking a question that didn't need to be asked. He examined Salvatore for 15 minutes and wrote 2 words on the paperwork: heart attack. No one objected. There was no reason to object. A 59-year-old man who worked 16 hours a day, who had smoked since he was 17, collapsing in a warm room after a long night. That was the sort of thing that happened to men his age every day, all over this city. Tristan signed the papers. He arranged the funeral. He sat in the front row and shook hands with 200 people. But there was one detail he couldn't let go of. The glass. His father didn't drink during meetings, not once in 20 years. He had a rule. Drinking came afterward, when everything was finished and the doors were locked. Yet that night there had been a glass in front of him, half full, and it had been poured while the meeting was still going on. Tristan didn't say anything to anyone. Before the family's men had a chance to clean the room, he personally removed the glass from warehouse number 4, wrapped it, and sent it to a private laboratory in New Jersey, where no one knew who he was. 3 weeks later, the results came back. In the residue at the bottom of the glass was a plant-derived alkaloid extract, colorless, odorless, completely soluble in hard liquor, capable of disrupting the heart's electrical conduction and causing cardiac arrest within a matter of hours. It wasn't included in the standard toxicology panel at any hospital in New York. If no one went looking for it, then it didn't exist. And no one had gone looking for it, because the paperwork already contained a perfectly reasonable answer. Tristan read the laboratory report inside his car beneath the overhead light, and he sat there without moving for a very long time. He had the poison. He didn't have the hand that had used it. There had been 4 people in that meeting that night. 3 were still alive, and all 3 had stood at the funeral and wept. He had all 3 watched for 2 years. Not one of them did anything wrong. No unexplained money, no unusual trips, no suspicious phone calls. By the 3rd year, 2 of the 3 had died for unrelated reasons, and that door closed. 15 years later, that laboratory report was still lying in the bottom drawer of his desk. He had never thrown it away. During the first 3 years after the funeral, Tristan had a habit that only one person in the house knew about. He would wake at 4 o'clock in the morning and go down to the kitchen and sit. He didn't read anything. He didn't do anything. He simply sat there, and every time, about 10 minutes later, Vincent Graziano would appear in the doorway, switch on a small lamp in the corner, place a cup of coffee on the table, and sit down in the chair across from him. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask any questions. He stayed there until dawn, then stood up and went about his work. The night Tristan's father died, Vincent had also been the one who drove him from warehouse number 4 back to Oyster Bay, and throughout that entire hour-and-a-half drive, neither man said a single word. Adrian Sabatini was a debt Tristan repaid in a different way. 7 years earlier, In an alley in Newark, the two of them had stepped out through the back door of a warehouse, and someone was already waiting at the far end of the alley. Adrian saw him first. He grabbed Tristan with both hands and pulled him down, then stood between him and the gun for half a second. That half second went into Adrian's left shoulder. 3 weeks in a Newark hospital, and for all 3 weeks he refused morphine. A nurse asked him why, and he said the drug made him sleep, and if they came back, he needed to be awake. Tristan sat there with him through many nights. From that day forward, no one in the organization ever questioned Adrian Sabatini again. Tristan kept his promise to his father word for 15 years. He never owed anyone a second time. He repaid everything the moment he received it. Money, favors, blood. He never allowed anyone to have the right to demand anything from him. That way of living made him a man who couldn't be bought and couldn't be threatened. It also made him a man who didn't have a single person he could call at 4 o'clock in the morning. Some promises save us from our enemies, and some promises lock us inside with them. 40 minutes west of Oyster Bay by train, there was another woman who also woke at 4 o'clock in the morning, and for a reason no one ever thought to ask about. At 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the dialysis center in Queens opened its doors for the first session of the day. Delilah Whitfield was 27 years old. She pushed the wheelchair through the automatic doors, stopped at the registration desk, and recited her mother's name and date of birth the way someone might recite a prayer she'd known by heart for 4 years. Helen Whitfield was 58, with end-stage kidney failure, 3 treatments a week, 4 hours each time. Delilah removed her mother's coat, folded it neatly across her lap, checked her left arm where the vascular access was, then took a bottle of water from her bag and placed it in her mother's hand. She did those things in exactly the same order, without a single unnecessary movement, like someone who had done them 500 times before. The technician rolled the machine over. Helen turned to look at her daughter. "Go home and sleep, honey. You don't need to sit here for 4 hours. Delilah pulled the plastic chair closer. "I'm not going home. I don't have to get on the train until 9. Helen was quiet for a moment, then asked the question she always asked. "Is the new job all right?" "It's fine. Are they kind to you?" "They don't say anything to me, Mom." "That's good." Helen nodded, but she didn't take her eyes off her daughter. She knew the price of that new job. 4 years earlier, when she first began dialysis, there had been a 3-month waiting period before Medicare took effect, and after that came 20% coinsurance, with no upper limit, plus medication, plus transportation 3 times a week. And as of that morning, the number written on the paper in the drawer at home was $96,000. Delilah knew that number down to the last cent. She also knew exactly why it existed. When she was 22, she had been in her 3rd year of nursing school, with only 3 semesters left before graduation. Then her father died, and within a month she understood that if she remained in the lecture hall, there would be no one to take her mother to dialysis. She withdrew from school. She didn't tell anyone the story, and she never complained about it, not even to her mother. She worked housekeeping at a hotel in Manhattan for 3 years, taking the night shift because it paid $2 more an hour. 2 years earlier, a guest claimed a watch had gone missing. They called Delilah into human resources at 11 o'clock at night. She sat there for 3 hours, repeating the same sentence over and over, and not one person in that room changed a single word of what they had already decided. In the end, they didn't call the police. They didn't press charges. There was no official report. They simply fired her and placed one short line in her internal employment record. No one apologized to her, but after that, every place she applied to called her back once and then went silent. For 2 years, she survived on hourly work, cleaning houses, sitting overnight with elderly people, doing anything that would pay her cash by the end of the day, until 6 weeks ago. A staffing agency called her about a live-in housekeeping position in Oyster Bay, with decent pay and room and board included. Room and board were the 3 most important words in that entire phone call, because they meant every dollar she earned could go directly toward the hospital debt, without a single cent being taken out for rent or food. The interviewer didn't ask anything about the hotel. Delilah had prepared an answer, and she never had to use it. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Honey, yes, Mom. Those people are very rich, aren't they?" Delilah looked down at her hands. "I don't know, Mom. I only go from the kitchen to the 3rd floor, then from the 3rd floor back to the kitchen. I don't look around." Then she added one more sentence in an ordinary voice, as casually as if she were talking about the weather. I don't touch anything that doesn't belong to me. Not ever again. Helen didn't answer. She simply reached out, and Delilah took her hand. Beneath the collar of Delilah's shirt, resting close against her skin, was a very thin chain, and hanging from it was her mother's wedding ring. Helen had taken it off herself the previous winter and given it to her daughter, telling her to sell it. Twice, Delilah had gone as far as the entrance of a pawnshop on Roosevelt Avenue. The first time, she stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes. The second time, she had actually placed her hand on the door. Both times, she turned away and walked back toward the train station. A little before 9, the technician came over to check the machine. Delilah stood, pulled the thin blanket all the way up to her mother's chest, adjusted the angle of the pillow behind her neck so it wouldn't grow sore, then bent down and whispered into her ear that on Thursday she would come half an hour earlier. Helen was already asleep. Delilah walked out the door at 9 o'clock, took 2 trains, and reached the estate just in time for the start of her shift. They had hired her because she worked cleanly, never took time off, never asked questions, never looked around, and had no one to call if something happened to her. There are jobs people are given precisely because they look like the kind of person who would never dare ask a single question. That Tuesday morning, while Delilah Whitfield was still sitting on her second train, there was already a man in Oyster Bay who had been awake for hours. 4 o'clock in the morning, Tristan prepared the steel razor case his father had once used, though he waited until 5:30 that afternoon just before leaving for Midtown to step in front of the dressing room mirror. He wasn't a man who cared for theatrics. He had considered using animal blood, paint, even an ink pouch hidden inside the lining of his shirt, and he rejected all of it. Anything false would smell false in a room full of people who knew how to look. If he wanted the entire house to believe he was bleeding, then he had to bleed for real. He angled his left shoulder toward the light, held the blade at a slant, and cut 2 parallel lines into the skin, each roughly 3 finger joints long and less than half an inch deep. He didn't flinch. He set the blade down, washed his hands, pressed a piece of gauze against his shoulder, and held it there for 7 minutes until the bleeding slowed. Then, using one hand, he wrapped the wound himself, awkwardly, crooked and uneven, exactly the way a man would bandage himself inside a car. At precisely 5:45, 3 knocks sounded at the door. Leo Barone stepped inside and stopped 2 paces away. He didn't look at Tristan's shoulder. He didn't ask a single question. Tristan handed him a sheet of paper written in his own hand. There was no plan on it, no restaurant name, no address, only 7 names, and beside each name, a time. This was the list of people who would be told that Tristan had been shot that evening, and the exact time each one would receive the information. The first at 7:40, the second at 7:55, 15 minutes apart, one after another. Leo read the entire page, then looked up, and he immediately understood what no one else in the house would understand. If the rumor appeared outside before a certain time, then it could only have leaked from one of the names listed above that time. The trap in the office was the trap anyone might anticipate. This sheet of paper was the second layer, and aside from the 2 men standing in that room, no one else in the world knew it existed. Leo folded the paper. What about the other part? The rest had already been sitting on the table since that afternoon. At 7 o'clock that evening, in a restaurant in Midtown, Tristan sat across from 2 associates he didn't trust and never had. The meeting lasted 40 minutes, and everything discussed during it was completely meaningless, because the meeting wasn't meant to accomplish anything at all. At exactly 7:38, 2 men in dark clothing entered the corridor leading toward the restrooms, fired 3 shots into the ceiling, then walked straight through the rear emergency exit and disappeared within 15 seconds. Plaster from the ceiling scattered across the carpet. Tristan's 2 associates dropped flat to the floor. No one was hurt. No one called the police, because it was the kind of restaurant that didn't call the police, and because within 5 minutes, men from the family were already standing at the entrance, calmly instructing everyone to leave. Tristan was the last person out. One hand held his left shoulder, and he walked with his body tilted slightly to one side. 3 people saw him leave that way. 3 people were more than enough. By 9 o'clock that night, people in Bensonhurst were already talking about how someone had opened fire on Tristan Castellano in the middle of Midtown and put a bullet into his shoulder. By 9:20, that version of the story had crossed the river and reached the Rinaldi family. The car reached the gates of the estate at 9:15. Vincent Graziano was already standing in the foyer, and he stood exactly as Tristan had seen him stand for 24 years, hands folded in front of his stomach, back straight, not taking a single step forward until he was permitted to do so. When the door opened and he saw the darkened fabric on Tristan's left sleeve, the color in his face changed. "Let me call Dr. Price." "No, doctor." "Sir, your shoulder." I said no. Vincent fell silent. Then he nodded once. A short, dry nod. Exactly the way he used to nod at Tristan's father, whenever Salvatore Castellano made a decision Vincent disagreed with, but would never openly challenge. In this house, no one asked a second time. Vincent stepped back, cleared the way, then walked ahead into the corridor to turn on the lights. Tristan followed. Halfway down the main hall, he passed a young woman wiping the stair railing with a damp cloth. She heard his footsteps, stopped working, pressed herself close to the wall, and lowered her head. He passed within about 3 feet of her. He didn't look at her. He didn't know her name, didn't know how long she had worked there, and at that moment there was no room in his mind for someone like her. He entered his office, closed the door, and turned the lock himself. Now everything was exactly where it needed to be. He sat on the edge of the leather chair, looked at the locked door, and waited for the pain in his shoulder to become sharp enough to keep him alert. In 15 years, he had learned that you didn't catch a traitor by asking questions. You caught one by becoming the thing they had been waiting for. There are wounds a man gives himself with his own hand, simply so he can discover who has been stabbing him in the back all these years. By 9:38, Tristan had been lying there for half an hour, and his body had already learned the breathing rhythm of a man who was about to lose consciousness. He didn't think about anything while he waited. He only listened. The pendulum clock in the corner, water running from the western eaves, a door somewhere upstairs closing very softly. Then, at 9:40, there were 3 knocks at the door. 3 light knocks, evenly spaced, the kind made by someone who wasn't truly expecting an answer. Tristan didn't respond. 4 seconds passed. Then he heard metal touch the lock from the other side. In the entire estate, only 3 keys to that room existed. One was in his coat pocket at that moment. One belonged to Leo Barone, and Leo was outside at the north gate. The third hung from the ring of keys Vincent Graziano had worn at his side for 24 years. A ring that gave a faint metallic jingle every time he walked through the halls, a sound Tristan had heard so often that he had long since stopped noticing it. The lock turned. The door opened, and Tristan recognized the footsteps by the second step. He had been hearing those footsteps since he was 14 years old. There wasn't even a moment when he wondered who it was. He simply lay still, eyes closed, and felt the full weight of 15 years settle across his chest. The door closed. Then the lock turned once more, this time from the inside. The footsteps came closer and stopped about 1 step from the chair. There was a long silence, longer than Tristan had expected. The man standing there did nothing for almost a full minute. Then Tristan felt the faintest trace of warmth pass through the space between his nose and upper lip. The back of a hand had been brought close and held there, counting. The hand was dry, a little rough across the knuckles, and Tristan knew exactly who it belonged to. Then 2 fingers settled against the side of his neck, just below the jaw, pressing gently in precisely the right place. He felt them remain there for a very long time. There was one thing Tristan hadn't anticipated, and it happened in that moment. He wasn't angry. The anger didn't come. Something else came instead, quieter and heavier, like the floor disappearing beneath his back. Because in his mind, suddenly and with painful clarity, there appeared an afternoon in September when he was 14 years old, when his father told him he had to wear a suit to a funeral, and he stood in front of a mirror for half an hour, unable to tie his necktie. The very man standing beside the chair now had walked in, stood behind him, reached his arms around Tristan's shoulders, and slowed down every step, twice, until the knot sat straight. He had even said something Tristan still remembered now, that people looked at a man's collar before they looked at his face. That man had opened the door for him every morning for 24 years. That man had driven him home from warehouse number 4 on the night his father died, and hadn't spoken a single word during the entire hour-and-a-half drive. And that was exactly what Tristan had needed that night. That man had sat across from him at the kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning for 3 years, never asking questions, never offering comfort, simply setting down a cup of coffee and sitting there until dawn. The 2 fingers lifted from his neck. Then everything happened quickly and neatly. with the precise rhythm of someone who had folded bed linens in this house for 24 years and knew exactly how long every task should take. Tristan heard the leather cover open, heard pages turning, then 17 small clicks of a camera shutter. He heard an envelope lifted and set back down. Then he heard the faint sound of glass touching the rim of a drinking glass, followed by the sound of a small, stirring stick making 2 circles, and he didn't know what it was, only that it hadn't appeared in any version of the plan he had constructed in his mind over the previous 3 nights. The footsteps moved away. Tristan thought it was over. It wasn't. The footsteps returned, coming closer than before. Then Tristan felt a light weight settle over his legs and begin to rise. The gray wool blanket that had been draped over the back of the chair was lifted with both hands, drawn up over his stomach, over his chest, and laid just beneath his neck. The hand smoothed the edge of the blanket over his left shoulder, where the wound was, with great care, much more slowly than any other movement in the room that night. Then it lingered there for about 1 second before pulling away. It was the hand of the man who had taught him how to tie a necktie. The footsteps left. The lock turned. The door closed, and the soft jingle of the keys faded farther and farther down the hall until it disappeared completely. Tristan remained motionless beneath that blanket for a long time afterward, without opening his eyes, without moving, in a room where everything he needed was already safely in his hands. He had caught the traitor. He had done exactly what he had planned to do. Every detail had fallen perfectly into place, and it gave him nothing at all. When an enemy betrays us, we become angry. When the man who taught us how to tie a necktie betrays us, something inside us dies that no cemetery could ever bury. At 10:22, when every light on the lower floor had been turned off except for 2 in the main hallway, Delilah Whitfield still had one task left unfinished. The afternoon tea tray that had been brought up at 4 o'clock hadn't yet been taken away. In the shift log there was a handwritten note from her first week in the house, saying that no china was to be left overnight on the first floor, and she had read that line enough times that she no longer needed to remind herself of it. She carried the empty tray down the hallway. 40 minutes earlier, while she was still folding towels in the linen room, she had seen the butler come out of that room and walk straight toward the service stairs without looking back or stopping anywhere along the way. For someone who had been working there only 6 weeks, there was only one way to understand that. The owner had finished his work for the evening and gone upstairs. The room was empty now. She knocked twice. No one answered. She waited, knocked once more, then opened the door. Inside, only a single desk lamp was still burning. A man lay on the long leather chair against the wall, covered with a blanket up to his neck, one arm hanging over the side. He was breathing, but the rhythm wasn't right. Each breath grew heavy toward the end, and there was a pause in the middle that an ordinary ear wouldn't have noticed. Delilah noticed. She stopped in the doorway, and the first thought that passed through her mind wasn't who he was, but that he wasn't breathing properly. Then she saw the glass. It sat on the desk a little over an inch from the edge, directly beside the hand hanging down, at exactly the distance where one careless movement could reach it. The liquid inside was dark, catching the lamplight in a thin line along the rim. Some things appear before thought has time to arrive. For 20 years, her father had fallen asleep in the armchair in their living room, in exactly that position. His head tilted to one side, one hand hanging down, and beside that hand there had always been a glass. From the time she was 7 until she was 22, she had carried hundreds of glasses like that to the sink and poured them out before he woke, and she had believed that if she did it enough times, there would eventually be a morning when something would be different. She had poured every one of them away, and he had still died. Delilah set the tray on the edge of the desk. She walked around to the side where his hand hung loose, picked up the glass with both hands, and carried it to the large potted plant in the corner beside the window. She tilted the glass. The liquid sank into the soil and disappeared without making a sound. She remained there for another 2 seconds until the final drop fell, then carried the empty glass to the small kitchenette at the end of the hallway, rinsed it 3 times with hot water, dried it, and filled it with filtered water to exactly the same level where the old liquid had been. She brought the glass back, set it in precisely the same place, then measured the distance again with 3 joints of her own index finger, a little over an inch, no more and no less. During all that time, she didn't look at the leather-bound book lying open on the desk. She didn't look at the thick envelope protruding from the far edge of the table. She knew they were there. Of course she knew. But her eyes didn't travel toward them, just as her hands didn't travel toward them. And that was something she had trained into herself over the 2 years since the night she had spent 3 hours sitting inside the human resources office of a Manhattan hotel. She didn't ask herself what she was doing in this room. If someone had asked her at that exact moment why she had poured away something that didn't belong to her inside the office of an employer she had never spoken a single word to, she wouldn't have been able to answer. Her hands had done it before her mind had time to object. She picked up the tray and turned toward the door. And that was when, as she passed the chair and the desk lamp cast its light from a different angle, she saw it. On the man's right sleeve, just beneath the edge of the blanket, there was a dark stain. It wasn't a shadow. It was spreading. Delilah stopped. The tray in her hands tilted slightly, and a spoon slid across the metal surface with one brief sound. She held her breath and looked down at the man's face. He didn't move. His breathing was still heavy, still interrupted by that pause in the middle. She watched the dark stain for another 3 seconds, and she understood better than anyone else in that house that when blood soaked through fabric that way, it meant the dressing underneath was saturated, and once a dressing was saturated, it couldn't hold anything more, and if a man slept through the night with a dressing like that, by morning the problem wouldn't simply be a stained shirt. She had studied nursing for 3 years. Those 3 years had never left her. She also knew something else, and she knew it very clearly. There was a rule in this house that everyone had told her on her very first day, using exactly one short sentence. She set the tray down on the floor, very gently. There are things people do not because they're brave, but because their bodies learned how to do them a long time ago. Delilah stood perfectly still for exactly 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, she could hear the clock in the corner with startling clarity. She knew the rule. They had told her on her very first day, in a single sentence, that no one touched the master of the house. She had watched that rule at work for 6 weeks. The gardener stopped nearly 10 feet away before lowering his head in greeting. The person setting the table placed the plate down, stepped back twice, and only then turned away. Even the head of security, the large man who was always walking behind him, only opened the car door and let his hand fall back to his side. He never reached out to steady him. In this house, distance was a kind of law. But Delilah had studied nursing for 3 years, and a blood-soaked dressing was still a blood-soaked dressing, no matter whose shoulder it covered. She went out to the hallway cabinet. She knew the first aid kit was in the second drawer because she had cleaned that cabinet the week before. She carried it back inside, closed the door behind her, and knelt beside the chair. She pulled the edge of the blanket down from his left shoulder. She unfastened the cufflinks and folded his sleeve up to the elbow. The dressing underneath was completely soaked through at one corner. She took the small scissors from the kit, slipped one blade beneath the outer edge, and cut along the old bandage. Her hand trembled through the first 3 cuts. By the 4th, it steadied, and from then on it didn't shake again. She removed the gauze. Then she stopped. The wound looked nothing like anything she had prepared herself to see. There were 2 cuts. They were straight. They ran parallel to each other. They were evenly spaced. Their edges were clean and precise, not torn, not ragged, with nothing ripped away. They were less than half an inch deep. Delilah had spent 2 full semesters studying photographs of gunshot wounds, and she knew bullets didn't enter the human body in straight lines. Bullets didn't leave 2 parallel cuts behind. The only thing that could leave a wound like this was a very thin, very sharp blade and a very steady hand. She sat back on her heels. She stared at those 2 cuts for several more seconds, and she understood the first thing, that this man hadn't been shot anywhere at all. Then she understood the second thing, and the second thing sent a chill down her spine. If he had done this to himself, then he was waiting for someone, and she had just stepped directly into the middle of whatever he was waiting for. During those 3 seconds, she could have stood up and walked out. She didn't. She opened the bottle of saline, soaked a clean piece of gauze, and cleaned around the 2 cuts from the inside outward, in exactly the sequence they had taught her during her first year. She dried the edges of the skin. She placed fresh gauze over the wounds, pressed gently, and held it there for 10 seconds. She wrapped the bandage across his shoulder and beneath his arm 3 times, tight enough to hold but not tight enough to press painfully against him. She cut the bandage, folded the edge, and secured it with 2 small strips of medical tape. She pulled his sleeve back down. She fastened both cufflinks again. Then she took the edge of the gray wool blanket in both hands, drew it up over his chest, and laid it just beneath his neck. She smoothed the fold in the middle. She adjusted the corner of the blanket over his left shoulder so it wouldn't press against the place she had just bandaged. She stood up. The thick envelope on the desk was protruding over the edge, its outermost sheet almost hanging in the air. She placed her palm against the side of the envelope and pushed it toward the center of the desk. She didn't open it. She didn't count anything. She didn't look inside. She pushed it the same way she might push a plate toward the center of a tray, then withdrew her hand. The leather-bound book lay open, its spine bent backward, the pages on both sides curling upward. She closed it and ran one finger along the spine until the pages lay flat. She gathered the first aid kit, closed the lid, and picked it up. Before leaving, she remained beside the chair for another moment. She looked down at the man lying there, and she didn't think about the name that made people all across Brooklyn lower their voices. She thought about a cramped living room in Queens, an old armchair, and a morning when she had walked in and understood that this time there was no glass left for her to pour away. She bent a little closer and spoke very softly, not because she expected him to hear her, because she was certain he couldn't. "Please don't drink anymore. My father used to sleep exactly like this too." Then she straightened, picked up the tray and the first aid kit, walked out, and closed the door behind her so gently that the latch barely made a sound. The room fell silent again. The man in the chair didn't move, didn't open his eyes, and his breathing remained in exactly the rhythm he had practiced for 3 nights. Only one thing happened. Along his left temple, a single drop of water slid downward, past the edge of his ear, and disappeared into the skin beneath it. For 15 years, no hand had touched him without a price attached. There are walls built from blood and time, and sometimes all it takes to make the first crack is someone pulling a blanket up over you. He remained perfectly still for another 4 minutes after the door closed. Then he opened his eyes and sat up. His left shoulder hurt exactly where the blade had passed through at 4 o'clock that morning, but the pain was now contained beneath a clean bandage wrapped 3 times, snug without being too tight, its edge carefully folded and taped down. A far better dressing than the one he had put on himself in the dressing room. He sat there looking at the sleeve of his shirt, both cufflinks fastened again. Then he reached beneath the desk and pressed twice on the small brass bell mounted under the wooden surface, something only 2 people in the house knew existed. 3 minutes later, Leo Barone entered, followed by Dr. Owen Price, who had been at the estate since 8 o'clock that evening, waiting in a downstairs room the entire time. No one exchanged a greeting. Leo turned the lock. Tristan opened the top drawer on the right and took out a second crystal glass, identical to the one standing on the desk, the same design, the same engraved base. That glass contained whiskey. The glass that had sat on the desk all evening had never contained a single drop of alcohol. Only diluted black tea mixed to match the color, which meant whatever Vincent Graziano had dripped into it earlier that evening had fallen into a trap, and whatever the maid had poured away at 10:22 had also been a trap. The only thing that didn't know that was the potted plant in the corner. Price walked over to it, knelt down, used a metal spoon to scoop a sample of soil from directly beneath the stem, sealed it inside a tube, wrote the time on the label, and left through the rear door. Leo placed a computer on the desk. 3 cameras hidden behind the row of book spines on the eastern shelf had been recording since noon. He opened the file and turned the screen toward Tristan. Tristan watched from the beginning. He watched the door open at 9:40. He watched the 62-year-old man turn the lock from the inside, walk to the chair, bring the back of his hand close to Tristan's nose, and hold it there. He watched 2 fingers press against the side of his own neck. He watched the leather-bound book being turned through, 17 times, evenly spaced. He watched 5 banknotes being taken out, folded in half, and slipped into the inside pocket of the man's vest. He watched a small vial come out of a pocket, and 3 drops fall into the liquid in the glass. Then he watched the man return, take the blanket in both hands, draw it up to Tristan's neck, and smooth the edge over his left shoulder. That part lasted 11 seconds. Tristan said nothing. He only gave one very small nod. Then he reached out and rewound it. He watched those 11 seconds one more time. Leo waited until it ended, then reached forward to close the computer. Not yet. Leo withdrew his hand. On the screen, the timestamp jumped to 10:22, and the door opened for the second time. A woman entered carrying a tray. Tristan didn't know her name. He watched her stop in the doorway, tilt her head, and listen. He watched her look at the glass, carry it to the corner of the room, and pour the contents into the potted plant. He watched her leave, return, place the empty glass back down, then measure the distance from the edge of the desk using 3 joints of her own finger. He watched her pick up the tray and walk toward the door, then suddenly stop. He watched her set the tray on the floor. He watched her leave and return with the first aid kit, kneel beside the chair, fold up his sleeve, and cut away the old bandage. He watched her sit back on her heels when she saw the 2 cuts, and he could clearly see the exact moment she understood what they were. He watched her remain there for 3 seconds, then bend forward and continue. He watched her clean the wounds, dress them, pull his sleeve back down, and fasten both cufflinks. He watched her draw the blanket all the way to his neck and smooth it flat. He watched her place her palm against the envelope and push it toward the center of the desk without opening it, without counting anything, then immediately pull her hand away. He watched her close the leather-bound book and run a finger along its spine. He watched her remain beside the chair, lean down, and say something of which the microphone captured only the first 2 words. Then he watched himself lying there, motionless, and saw a very thin streak of light travel down his left temple before disappearing beneath the edge of his ear. Leo Barone stared directly at the screen and didn't turn toward him. Tristan reached out and rewound the recording. He watched it a second time from the moment she placed the tray on the floor. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Price returned. He stood in the middle of the room, his face deathly pale beneath the light of the desk lamp. "Same formula, sir. Exactly the same substance we found in your father's blood 15 years ago." Tristan didn't ask him to repeat it. He turned his head toward the corner of the room. The potted plant stood there where it had stood for 40 years. The plant his mother had grown from a cutting and insisted they move from the old house when she came here. It was the only thing in that room he hadn't bought with money and couldn't buy again. Among the lower leaves, one had already begun turning yellow. There are nights when a man watches the recording of the very night he has just lived through and realizes that he lived 2 different lives inside the same room. Throughout the entire next day, Tristan didn't say a single unusual word to Vincent. He accepted coffee from his hand at 7 o'clock in the morning, nodded as he had every other morning for 24 years, and let him pour a second cup. At 11 o'clock that night, Leo Barone went up to the 3rd floor and asked the butler to come down to the cellar. The cellar had once been a wine cellar, until Salvatore Castellano had the wooden racks torn out and all 4 walls faced with stone 40 years earlier. No windows, no echo. Anything spoken in that room seemed to fall to the floor and remain there forever. Leo didn't handcuff him. Leo didn't touch him. He simply walked half a step behind, keeping the proper distance, and 3 times on the spiral staircase, he extended a hand in front of Vincent for him to steady himself, then withdrew it again when Vincent didn't take it. There was only 1 wooden table and 2 chairs in the room. Tristan was already seated on one side. He didn't stand when Vincent entered. He didn't invite him to sit either. Vincent pulled out the chair himself and sat down, placing both hands flat on the table, and Tristan realized that he already knew. He had known since morning, perhaps from the moment he saw Leo standing at the end of the 3rd floor hallway at 10 o'clock. Tristan placed the phone on the wooden surface, turned the screen toward him, and pressed play. No words accompanied it. Vincent Graziano lasted 27 seconds. He watched himself turn the lock from the inside. He watched himself bring the back of his hand close to the nose of the man lying in the chair. He watched himself place 2 fingers against that man's neck and count. At the 27th second, just as the small vial appeared on the screen, being taken from his pocket, Vincent collapsed forward over the table, his forehead touching the wood, and he didn't raise his head again. He cried the way a 62-year-old man cries when he has never cried in front of anyone before, dry and nearly soundless, his entire back shaking in short waves. Tristan turned off the screen and waited. He said nothing for almost 2 minutes. Then Vincent began to speak, his face still lowered against the table. Paul, his only son, Paul Graziano, 35 years old, was serving the 4th year of a 9-year sentence in a federal prison in Pennsylvania. 5 months earlier, Vincent had received a call from a number he didn't recognize. The person on the other end didn't threaten him at all. They only said that someone inside the prison had been paid, and that what happened next depended on him. Then, once every 2 weeks, he was allowed to hear his son call home for exactly 4 minutes. Every time, Paul said exactly the same things he had said before. "I'm fine, Dad. Don't worry. Take care of yourself." Always in the same order, with the same pauses, as though he were reading from a sheet of paper someone had written and placed in front of him. Only his voice grew thinner each time. Vincent raised his head. He didn't apologize. He only said that he had sat at the kitchen table at 4 o'clock in the morning for 3 years with Salvatore Castellano's son. and that he had thought about it over and over for 5 months, and he couldn't find any other way out. He didn't know who was behind it. The instructions came by text message, from a number that changed every week, never naming anyone, never referring to anything inside the estate by its proper name. He had never seen anyone's face. Tristan asked one question. What about the vial? Vincent fell silent. Then he said the vial was different. The vial had been placed directly into his hand at 4 o'clock the previous afternoon, inside the garage of this very house, between 2 concrete columns where there were no cameras. The person who handed it to him wasn't wearing gloves, didn't cover their face, and didn't say a single word. They simply placed the vial into Vincent's palm, closed his fingers around it, then tapped twice on the back of his hand. Who? Vincent looked directly into Tristan's face for the first time since entering the room. Adrian Sabatini. The name fell onto the stone table and remained there, just like everything else that had ever been spoken inside that room. Tristan didn't ask again. He didn't ask whether Vincent was certain. Didn't ask whether he might have mistaken someone else. He sat still for about 10 seconds. And during those 10 seconds, not a single muscle moved in his face. Then he stood, walked around the table, and placed a hand on the shoulder of the seated man, that very shoulder. At his father's funeral, after all 200 mourners had gone, and only 2 people remained standing beside the grave, 23-year-old Tristan had rested his forehead against that same shoulder for 40 seconds, and Vincent Graziano had stood perfectly still until Tristan finally raised his head. Tristan spoke, his voice as low and even as ever. Tomorrow morning, my lawyer will file a petition to have Paul transferred into protective custody, together with every record of the threats. I can't promise they'll approve it immediately. I promise I'll see it through to the end. Vincent began crying for the second time, and this time the sound came out. There are people who betray us out of greed, and there are people who betray us because they're forced to choose between us and the thing they love most in this world. At 7:10 the next morning, no one brought coffee up to the study, because the man who had carried coffee to that room every morning for 24 years had been in the cellar since the night before and wouldn't be coming upstairs again. Tristan sat for another 10 minutes, then stood and went down to the kitchen himself. In 6 years, he had never once set foot inside the eastern kitchen of his own house. She was wiping down the steel work table in the center of the room when he walked in. She heard his footsteps, looked up, and her entire body went rigid. The cloth in her hand stopped halfway across the surface. She straightened and stepped back half a pace, her hands lowered in front of her stomach, her eyes fixed on the floor, exactly the posture they had taught her during her first week. Tristan stopped at the opposite end of the table. He didn't come any closer. What's your name? Delilah Whitfield, sir. How long have you worked here? 6 weeks, sir. He let a brief silence pass, then continued in the same unchanged voice. Tell me what you did when you entered my study the night before last. She didn't answer immediately. In those exact 3 seconds, Delilah understood perfectly well where she was standing. She already had a sentence prepared, a perfectly reasonable one, that she had only been walking through the hallway and hadn't entered any room at all. No one had seen her. The entire lower floor had been dark by then. If she said that sentence, everything might end right here. She raised her eyes. Yes, sir. I went in to clear the afternoon tea tray. I know I wasn't permitted to. I'll accept whatever disciplinary action you decide on. And did you touch anything on my desk or take anything from that room? No. I poured out the liquid in the glass, replaced it with water, and cleared the tray. I didn't take a single thing. You know I have cameras in that room, don't you? I figured a man like you would. That's why I'm telling you the exact truth. You saw my wound. It wasn't a question. Delilah didn't answer. She didn't deny it either. She simply stood there, held his gaze, and said nothing at all. Have you told anyone? No, sir. Why? Because it isn't my business. There was no sound in the kitchen, except the hum of the freezer unit in the corner. Tristan gave one very short nod. He didn't thank her. He didn't explain. He said nothing more about that night, about the glass, the envelope, the leather book, or anything else. He turned and walked out. At the doorway, he stopped for half a second without looking back, then continued down the hall. Delilah remained alone in the middle of the kitchen, still holding the damp cloth. She waited until the sound of his footsteps had disappeared completely, before setting it down on the table. During her 6 weeks in that house, her heart had raced many times, and every time before, it had been because she was afraid of losing her job. This time it wasn't. She couldn't name the feeling, and she had no intention of trying. She only knew that someone in this house had asked her name, and in 6 weeks, it was the first time anyone had. At the other end of the hallway, about 50 feet from the kitchen doorway, a man stood with one shoulder against the wall beside a column, and he had been there since before Tristan came downstairs. Adrian Sabatini watched everything from beginning to end. He couldn't hear a single word. He didn't need to. He had walked at Tristan Castellano's right side for 12 years, had sat beside him through thousands of meetings, had learned to read the man through distance and posture, because that was the only way Tristan could be read. And what Adrian had just seen was something he hadn't seen once in 6 years. Tristan Castellano had gone down to the eastern kitchen, stopped, spoken face to face with a maid long enough to ask more than one question. Adrian added that to the other things he had already been adding up in his head for the past 2 days. Tristan had returned through the gates 40 minutes earlier than expected. He had refused a doctor so quickly that he hadn't sounded like a man who had just been shot, but like a man who knew exactly how deep his wound was. He had locked his study from the inside himself, something he never did. And that morning, Vincent Graziano hadn't been standing in the foyer at 7 o'clock, nor had he appeared anywhere else in the house, for the first time in 24 years. Adrian remained against the wall for another moment, then pushed away from it. He had waited 15 years, and he had originally intended to wait several more weeks, so everything could be finished cleanly. Now he understood that he didn't have several weeks anymore. He might have 2 days, maybe less. He walked down the hallway toward the stairs, and before he reached them, he had already decided what needed to be done. If Tristan had begun looking inward at the people inside his own house, then there needed to be someone ready for him to see first. There are truthful answers, more dangerous than any lie, and there are truthful answers that save a life. Adrian Sabatini did 3 things over the next 4 hours, and he did them in exactly the order he had planned. The first happened at 11 o'clock in the morning. One of his men, one of the 4 night guards assigned to the east gate, went up to the 3rd floor by the service stairs at a time when the entire housekeeping staff was downstairs in the dining room. He unlocked the small room at the end of the hall with a maintenance master key, stayed inside for 3 minutes, and came out empty-handed. In the second drawer of the wooden table beside the bed, beneath a notebook and a sewing kit, there were now 5 $100 bills. Those exact 5 bills. Their serial numbers matched the 5 bills that had been taken from the envelope the night before last, and all 5 had been marked with ultraviolet ink the previous afternoon when Tristan set the bait. Adrian knew about those markings because 12 years earlier, he had been the one who suggested that procedure to Tristan, and Tristan had used it ever since. The second thing was done at the same time. In that same drawer, beneath the paper lining at the bottom, there was now a cheap prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store in Flushing 4 days earlier. Its call log contained exactly 2 numbers. Both led to an extension at a logistics company across the river, a company everyone in the organization knew belonged to the Rinaldi family. The first call lasted 2 minutes and 10 seconds. The second lasted 40 seconds. Both had been made at times when the housekeeping department's time records showed that she was inside the estate. The third thing was the most important, and also the most subtle. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Adrian went up to the study, knocked on the door, and placed a thin file on Tristan's desk. He said nothing while Tristan opened it. Inside were printed personnel records for a live-in housekeeper who had been hired through a staffing agency and had worked there for 6 weeks. The third page was a copy of an internal note from a Manhattan hotel, dated 2 years earlier, concerning a guest's missing watch during the night shift and the termination of a housekeeper without a formal report and without the police being called. Tristan read all 3 pages. He said nothing. Adrian remained where he stood, both hands clasped behind his back, and when he finally spoke, there was nothing in his voice that sounded like accusation. It was the voice of the man who had sat at Tristan's right hand for 12 years and had told him things he hadn't wanted to hear. "I don't like this any more than you do, Tristan. But I have to say it. You think it's a coincidence. Someone comes into this house, works here for 6 weeks, and 6 weeks later, you nearly die." Then he fell silent. He didn't add another word, and that silence was what carried the real weight, because in 12 years he had never spoken 2 sentences when one was enough. That was exactly what made the whole thing work. Adrian Sabatini wasn't a stranger. He was the man who had pulled Tristan down in that alley in Newark. He was the man who had spent 3 weeks in the hospital and refused pain medication. He was the only person on the council who dared to tell Tristan, "You're wrong," in the middle of a meeting and still be sitting there the next day. In 15 years, every warning he had ever given had been at least half right. If there was one man in the world Tristan Castellano could listen to without checking twice, it was him. Tristan closed the file. He rested one hand on the cover and left it there for a moment. Then he spoke in the same low voice. "Leave it there." Adrian nodded and walked out, closing the door behind him. In the hallway, he didn't smile. He had waited 15 years, and he never smiled in the middle of a job. That same afternoon, on the 3rd floor, Delilah Whitfield opened an envelope the mail carrier had left the previous day in the shared employee mailbox. Inside was a notice from the hospital concerning additional testing for her mother, the portion not covered by insurance, due within 21 days. $4,200. She read the number once, then she read it a second time, more slowly, as though it might be different the second time around. In her head, she added this month's wages, next month's, and the month after that, and arrived at a number that didn't match. She didn't cry. She folded the paper into quarters, slipped it into the pocket of her uniform, and went downstairs so she wouldn't be late for the afternoon shift. Because in this house, being 5 minutes late was enough to earn a note in the log. She had no idea that downstairs, in the second drawer of the very room she had just left, something worth almost 100 times that amount was already lying there waiting for her. The best trader doesn't erase his own trail. He draws that trail onto someone else. At 6 o'clock that evening, Leo Barone came to the kitchen and told her to go up to the study. He didn't say why. Delilah took off her apron, hung it on the hook, and followed him down a hallway she had wiped with a damp cloth more times than she had ever walked through it. The door opened. She stepped inside and stopped 2 paces from the desk. 3 things had been arranged in a straight line across the wooden surface. 5 $100 bills, spread out like playing cards. A small black phone, and a stack of printed papers already open to the 3rd page. Adrian Sabatini stood behind her beside the door, both hands clasped behind his back, and he didn't say a single word from beginning to end. Tristan sat behind the desk. He didn't invite her to sit. "Do you recognize any of these things?" Delilah looked down. She looked at the 5 bills, and within 2 seconds all the blood drained from her face. Not because she was guilty, because she had stood in this exact position before, 2 years earlier, in another room, beneath another light, facing 3 people in suits whose names she couldn't remember. Her body recognized this room before her mind had time to understand it. She knew exactly what would happen next, in what order, and how it would end. "They were found in the drawer in your room this afternoon. Do you know this phone? Did you call anyone across the river? You worked at a hotel in Manhattan, didn't you?" Tristan asked the questions one at a time, leaving just enough space between them for her to answer. His voice didn't rise once. He didn't strike the desk, didn't lean forward, didn't emphasize a single word. And because of that, it carried more weight than any shout could have. Delilah raised her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She spoke only once, and she said everything in a single breath. "I didn't take them. But I know you won't believe me. It was the same last time. I sat there talking for 3 hours, and not one person in that room changed a single word of what they'd already decided. So this time I'm only going to say it once. I didn't take them. If you want to call the police, then call them. I'm only asking you for one thing. Let me send my mother a message, telling her I can't come this Thursday. She'll wait in the hallway until someone comes to pick her up. She can't get home by herself." Then she fell silent. She stood straight, her arms hanging at her sides, and she looked directly at him instead of staring at the floor the way she had for the past 6 weeks. That was the moment when everything inside Tristan Castellano pulled in one direction. Because everything on that desk fit. The 5 bills had the correct serial numbers. The phone contained 2 outgoing calls made at the exact times she had been inside the house. An old personnel file with a single line about something that had gone missing. And a woman who had entered this house 6 weeks earlier, exactly as Adrian had said. Because believing Adrian was easier. Adrian had spent 3 weeks in a Newark hospital because of him. Adrian had never been more than half wrong with him. And believing Adrian fit the promise Tristan had kept for 15 years. The promise that had taught him that the safest person in the world was the person he owed nothing, and the most dangerous was the person who had just done him a kindness he hadn't yet repaid. He looked at the woman standing in front of him, and he could see very clearly that if he believed her, then he would have to doubt the man who had taken a bullet for him. He stood up. "Take her back to her room. No one goes in. No one speaks to her. Wait until I verify everything." Adrian opened the door. Leo went first. Delilah followed, and when she passed through the doorway, she didn't look back. The door closed. Only Tristan and Adrian remained in the room. Adrian said one thing, very softly, that Tristan had done the right thing, and then he left as well. That night, Tristan remained alone in that room for a very long time. He didn't turn on the overhead lights. He didn't open the file and read it again. He sat on the edge of the leather chair where he had lain 2 nights earlier, and he looked toward the corner of the room. His mother's plant stood there beneath the glow of the desk lamp. 2 days earlier, only one leaf had begun turning yellow. Now an entire section of the lower leaves had yellowed, and 2 branches near the base had drooped until they touched the rim of the pot. It was dying, slowly, right in front of him, and there was nothing in the world he could buy to stop it. He sat there watching it, haunted by the rigid creed he had carried ever since that rainy night in warehouse number 4. For 15 years, he had lived by his father's final warning, refusing to owe a single soul a favor or a debt. That strict isolation had kept him alive. But tonight, staring into the shadows of his office, he wondered if that very rule had blinded him to the only genuine person under his roof. Some people are accused twice in one lifetime for the very same reason. They have no one to call. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Leo Barone knocked on the door and walked in with a laptop tucked under his arm. He didn't wait to be invited. He set the computer on the desk, opened it, and turned the screen toward Tristan. "I had every camera on the 3rd floor reviewed from this morning until now, sir." On the screen was the 3rd floor hallway, seen from the far end of the corridor. The timestamp read 2:07 in the afternoon. A man entered the frame, stopped in front of the last door in the hall, inserted a key into the lock, opened it, and stepped inside. 3 minutes later, he came back out, closed the door, locked it again, and walked toward the service stairs. His hands were empty. Tristan knew his face. One of the 4 night guards assigned to the east gate, one of Adrian Sabatini's men. Tristan said nothing. Leo switched to a second window. "There's something else. I had the staffing agency that placed her here checked." On the screen was a 3-tier ownership chart. The staffing agency in Mineola was owned by a management company in Garden City. That management company was owned by a legal entity registered in the state of Delaware. The only person listed under that entity was a woman Tristan had met 4 times in his life, at 4 different parties, sometime between 9 and 13 years earlier, Adrian Sabatini's former wife. Tristan looked at the name on the screen, and within seconds everything in his mind rearranged itself. She hadn't been planted here to kill him. If someone wanted him dead, they wouldn't have needed a housekeeper, and they wouldn't have needed 6 weeks. She had been planted here so she would already be in place when he died. A 27-year-old woman who had been working in the house for only 6 weeks, carrying $96,000 in medical debt, with no relative anywhere in the city capable of calling anyone who mattered, and with an old note already sitting in her file from 2 years earlier about something that had gone missing during a night shift, after which her former employer had fired her without filing a report. They had dropped her into this house and left her there, in exactly the right place, for exactly 6 weeks, until they needed to use her. When Tristan died, the police would have someone to arrest within 48 hours. The council would have someone to deal with, and the entire city would believe it immediately because the story was too reasonable and too easy to understand. And the man who took the empty chair would be the one demanding justice for him. Tristan stood. He didn't say a word. He left the room, walked down the hallway, climbed the main staircase, continued to the 3rd floor, and Leo followed 2 steps behind. When they reached the last door in the corridor, Tristan didn't knock. He turned the handle. The door wasn't locked. It was dark inside. Leo switched on the light. The narrow bed had been made perfectly flat, the blanket folded into a square at the foot, the pillow set neatly in place. The window was closed and latched. On the wooden table beside the bed, her uniform had been washed, dried, pressed smooth, and folded into a neat square, with the apron folded separately on top. Beside it lay the room key, placed carefully in its proper spot, and leaning against the base of the lamp was a piece of paper torn from a notebook, written in small, even handwriting with a ballpoint pen. "I'm leaving before you have to make me. Thank you for the 6 weeks." Tristan picked up the note. He read it once from beginning to end. The second drawer had been pulled open and left empty. The 5 bills and the phone had been removed that afternoon, and nothing had been put in their place. There was nothing in the room that belonged to her except the piece of paper now resting in his hand. Leo stepped outside to make a call. He came back less than 2 minutes later. The East Gate logged her leaving the grounds at 5:40 this morning, sir. The guard on duty says she walked toward the station. Today was Thursday. Tristan looked down at the note in his hand for another 2 seconds. She'll wait in the hallway until someone comes to pick her up. She can't get home by herself. Those were the last words Delilah had spoken in his study the night before, and he had heard them without hearing them. She hadn't asked to be cleared. She hadn't asked to stay. She had asked for exactly one thing, and that one thing hadn't been for herself. He folded the note and slipped it into his breast pocket. Then he turned to Leo and said 2 words. Find her. Leo had already reached the doorway when Tristan added one more thing. Don't let Adrian know. At 7:25 that morning, Leo called back. 3 of his men had reached the dialysis center in Queens. Helen Whitfield was inside. Her session had begun at 6 o'clock, and everything was normal. But her daughter wasn't in the hallway. The chair was empty. Her bag was still there, leaning against the leg of the chair, untouched. Tristan had spent 15 years learning how not to trust anyone. He had only 40 minutes to understand that this time he had been wrong. At 7:50 that morning, before Leo's call had even been made, Delilah Whitfield was walking down into basement level 2 of the parking garage. She had taken her mother into the treatment room at 6 o'clock as she did every Thursday, checked her left arm, and placed the bottle of water in her hand. Helen asked why she had come so early today, and Delilah told her she had the day off. Her mother didn't ask anything else. Delilah sat in the hallway for an hour and a half before remembering that she had left her bag in the medical shuttle driver's vehicle, and he had told her she could simply go down and get it, because the vehicle would remain parked in the basement until 9 o'clock. She took the stairs down. Basement level 2 was almost empty at nearly 8 in the morning. Fluorescent lights glowed overhead. A puddle of water sat at the bottom of the ramp, and somewhere behind her the ventilation fans hummed with a steady, mechanical rhythm. She had walked about 10 steps when she heard an engine moving slowly behind her. A white van stopped roughly 13 feet away. The side door slid open. 3 men stepped out. Delilah recognized the first man immediately. He was one of the night guards at the east gate of the estate. She had passed him at least 20 times during those 6 weeks, had nodded to him in greeting, and he had never once nodded back. She didn't scream. She didn't turn and run, because behind her was a concrete wall, and the stairs were on the other side of the van. In that brief sliver of time, she did exactly one thing. She raised her right hand to her neck, slipped her fingers inside her collar, caught hold of the chain, and pulled. The chain snapped at the clasp. Her mother's wedding ring fell onto the concrete with the faintest sound, bounced once, then rolled away and came to rest in the narrow gap between the 2 tires of a parked car. The van door slammed shut. The tires gave a soft squeal against the wet concrete as the van turned at the ramp. Then the engine faded, climbed toward basement level 1, and disappeared completely. The ring lay motionless beneath the fluorescent light, about a handspan from where it had fallen, in a place no one passing by would ever notice unless they were specifically searching for it. The entire thing took 31 seconds. There was no one else in that basement at the time. There wasn't a single sound loud enough to carry to the level above. And on the 3rd floor of the building, inside the dialysis room, Helen Whitfield still had another 3.5 hours left in her treatment, and she was asleep. 20 minutes later, Tristan Castellano's car stopped at the entrance to basement level 2. Leo had arrived 4 minutes earlier and was standing at the foot of the ramp. His men had already searched the entire level once and found nothing. None of the cameras on that floor had been operating at that hour, because the building's surveillance system recorded only basement level 1 and the elevator area. Tristan stepped out of the car and walked into the middle of the garage. He didn't ask anyone a single question. He moved slowly, his eyes lowered toward the concrete floor, walking like a man searching for something very small without yet knowing what that something was. When he reached the puddle, he stopped. Then he lowered one knee onto the wet concrete, bent down, and reached into the narrow space between 2 tires. He picked up a worn gold wedding ring with a broken piece of chain still attached at the clasp. He recognized it immediately. The previous morning in the kitchen, when Delilah had straightened and stepped back half a pace, that chain had slipped outside her collar and swung once before she lifted a hand and tucked it back inside. He had seen it. He hadn't said anything. He remained there, one knee against the wet concrete, the ring closed inside his palm, and something returned to his mind that he had never told another living soul in 15 years. That night in warehouse number 4, his father had said 2 things, not one. The first was the sentence Tristan had repeated to himself every day ever since. The second, he had never repeated to anyone. Not even Leo. Not even Vincent. Don't let fear turn you into a man with nothing left to lose, Tristan. He had lived by the first sentence for 15 years, word for word, and in doing so, he had lived in complete defiance of the second. With his own hands, he had emptied his life until no one remained close enough to be taken from him. No wife, no children, no friends, not a single person an enemy could use in exchange for his silence. It was the safest way a man in his position could choose to live. And for 15 years, it had also been a very slow way to die. He stood. He wiped the ring dry against his palm, wrapped the broken length of chain around it, and slipped it into his breast pocket beside the scrap of paper torn from the notebook. Today, for the first time, he had something to lose, and he was grateful for it in a way that was almost too much to bear. At 10:15 that morning, Tristan's phone vibrated once. A 90-second video had been sent from a number that wasn't saved in his contacts, accompanied by 3 lines of text. Alone. No weapons. Bring every transfer document for the network, signed in advance. 4 o'clock in the morning. He opened the video right there at his desk, and Leo stood behind his shoulder. The image shook, recorded on a handheld phone beneath the harsh light of a construction lamp hanging high overhead. Delilah Whitfield was sitting on the concrete floor with her back against a steel column, both hands bound behind her around the body of the column. She was still wearing the thin coat she had put on that morning. There were no visible injuries on her. Adrian Sabatini's voice came from somewhere outside the frame, calm, almost courteous, telling her to state her name and today's date to prove that she was still alive. Delilah raised her head and looked toward the camera. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She opened her mouth and began speaking in a steady, clinical voice that trembled slightly at first. The kind of voice anyone who had ever worked a hospital shift would recognize immediately. Female patient, 27 years old, conscious and fully oriented. Low body temperature, slight bluish discoloration around the lips, intermittent muscular shivering. Estimated room temperature approximately 36 degrees Fahrenheit. No windows visible. Ceiling approximately 30 feet high. Steel construction. Exposed crossbeams. Regular ship horn audible approximately once every 4 minutes. Coming from behind the patient. Strong odor of fish and ammonia. To the patient's left, a refrigeration piping system runs along the wall, painted yellow. On the opposite wall there is a very large patch of red paint, with multiple long streaks running downward. The video cut off at exactly that point. Adrian said something brief, something to the effect that she was panicking, and the screen went dark. No one in the study said anything for several seconds. Then Leo Barone turned and moved quickly into the adjoining room, where a list of every cold storage and freezer warehouse in the Southern Port District had already been spread across the long table, a list he had ordered compiled the night before. 11 locations. He picked up a red pen. Tristan restarted the video from the beginning, slowed it down, and read each sentence aloud. At the first sentence, Leo crossed out 4 names. All 4 were dry storage warehouses with no refrigeration systems and couldn't possibly reach 36 degrees Fahrenheit. At the second sentence, he crossed out 3 more. Those 3 were too far inland to hear a ship horn every 4 minutes, and all 3 had skylights in the roof. 4 remained. Leo stood staring at the 4 names, still holding the pen. All 4 had refrigeration pipes painted yellow. That had been port standard since the 1970s. All 4 had ceilings around 30 feet high. Fish and ammonia matched all 4. There was nothing else to eliminate. Then Tristan spoke, very softly, almost to himself. The red paint. Leo turned around, on the opposite wall. Paint running downward. That's number 4. 30 years earlier, the warehouses along the southern row had been numbered by hand, with painted numerals nearly 6 feet high, and at warehouse number 4, the worker had used too much paint, causing it to run in 4 long streaks all the way toward the base of the wall. No one had ever painted over it. Tristan had last seen that number on a rainy night 15 years earlier, when he ran in from the gate and looked up exactly once. Warehouse number 4, Red Hook Terminal, the very warehouse where his father had collapsed in the mezzanine room above. In the video, Delilah had no idea what she had just done. She didn't know there were 11 warehouses on the list. She didn't know Leo Barone was standing over a sheet of paper with a red pen in his hand. The man holding the phone had told her to speak so they could prove she was still alive. and the only thing she knew how to say clearly when someone asked her to describe the condition of a human being was what they had taught her for 3 years in lecture halls and hospital clinical rotations. Speak for the person who comes after you. Be precise. Mention even the things that seem unrelated, because the person taking over the case doesn't have your eyes. She had been shaking. She had been cold. She had been so frightened she could no longer feel her own hands. And she had held on to the one thing left inside her that could keep her from breaking apart. Standing in the damp basement at 8:10 that morning, right after placing the ring in his pocket, Tristan looked at Leo and gave him one immediate assignment in 2 sentences. He wanted 3 men at the dialysis center in Queens before 9 o'clock. They were to stay beside Helen Whitfield, secure her safe return home after her session, and guard her around the clock until further orders. Leo asked whether the council needed to be informed. Tristan said no. He told no one else in the house about it, recorded it nowhere, and during all the remaining hours of that day, he didn't mention it again. She had no idea she was drawing a map. She was simply doing exactly what they had taught her for 3 years, describing precisely what she could see so that whoever came after her would still have time to save her. At 4 o'clock in the morning, fog lay low over the water, and the entire dock district smelled of salt and rusted iron. 18 men from the family had been in position since 2 o'clock, spread among the rows of containers on the south and east sides. Leo Barone was stationed to the north, about 130 feet from the warehouse door, one hand resting on his radio. No headlights, no engines, not a single voice for those entire 2 hours. Tristan got out of the car alone, carrying a leather briefcase. Inside were the transfer documents for the entire Castellano network, stamped, signed in advance, and completely worthless. They only needed to look real enough to buy him 90 seconds inside that room. He had passed through this door once before, 15 years earlier, in the rain, to carry his father out. He pulled the door open. Inside, the warehouse was cold and vast. A construction lamp hung from a beam overhead, casting a circle of yellow light onto the concrete floor. Delilah sat against the steel column, her hands still tied behind her, lifting her head when she heard the door. Adrian Sabatini stood 2 steps away from her, a gun in his right hand pointed toward the floor. When Tristan stepped into the circle of light, Adrian raised the barrel and aimed it directly at the center of his chest. Not once did he point it toward the woman. "You're 15 minutes early. You haven't changed." Tristan didn't answer. Adrian began to speak, and he spoke like a man who had waited a very long time for the chance. Newark, 7 years earlier. The bullet that entered Adrian's shoulder that night had been fired by one of his own men from the far end of the alley, from a distance measured in advance and into a place chosen in advance. 3 weeks in the hospital and 3 weeks refusing morphine had been the most profitable investment of his life, because from that day forward, no one in the organization ever questioned Adrian Sabatini again. Then he came to the second thing, and his voice dropped lower. Warehouse number 4, the rainy night. There had been 4 men on the mezzanine, and the person who poured Salvatore Castellano's final drink was Adrian. Matteo Rinaldi had only paid for it. The man who stood beside the table and handed Salvatore that glass had been Adrian, 26 years old. He could have taken everything the following week, but he hadn't, because a family collapsing in on itself wasn't worth anything. So he stayed. He sat at the right hand of a 23-year-old son and waited 15 years for that son to rebuild everything 3 times larger than before. He didn't want a corpse. He wanted what the corpse would leave behind. Tristan listened to every word. He didn't become angry. His face didn't change. He asked only one question. What does she have to do with any of this? Adrian smiled for the first time that night. Nothing. That's exactly why she's perfect. Tristan set the briefcase down on the concrete. He stood straight and slowly raised both hands to shoulder height, exactly like a man who had run out of options. As he lifted his right hand, he turned his wrist exactly 1/4 turn. The face of his watch caught the construction light overhead and reflected a small point of light onto the steel crossbeam near the ceiling. 1 flash. 2 flashes. 3. On the north side, Leo Barone saw the light through a ventilation opening and raised the radio to his mouth. Delilah saw it too. She was so cold that she couldn't feel her hands anymore, but she saw that small point of light move across the steel beam 3 times, and she understood that it wasn't accidental. She did the only thing she could still do. She threw all her weight to the right. The rope snapped tight. The entire steel column shuddered and struck the metal sheeting behind it, sending a long metallic crash through the empty warehouse. Adrian turned his head for half a second. The main door burst open. Leo and 12 men poured in from the north, while another team entered through the loading entrance at the rear. The entire thing lasted less than 40 seconds. A single shot struck Adrian Sabatini in the right shoulder, and the gun fell from his hand and skidded across the concrete. 6 of his men dropped to their knees and placed their weapons on the floor. In the car on the way there, Tristan had made himself one promise. He wouldn't kill this man in a room where she could see it. He kept that promise. He walked straight to the steel column, dropped to one knee, and cut through the rope with the knife in his pocket. Her arms fell loose, and she couldn't bring them forward by herself. He removed his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, pulled both sides closed across her chest, then kept his hands there until the waves of shivering began to ease. She tried to speak. It took a while before any sound came out, and the first thing she said wasn't a question about herself. My mother. Thursday. She is safe. Since 9 o'clock yesterday morning. My men escorted her safely home after her treatment and have been guarding her in shifts ever since. She doesn't know who they are, and she doesn't need to know. Delilah looked at him. Then she collapsed forward, her forehead against his shoulder, and she cried for the first time since the van had stopped in basement level 2. Some promises are kept with guns, and some promises are kept with a plastic chair in a hospital hallway, where no one is there to see. The following afternoon, all 19 members of the Castellano Family Council filled the meeting room on the first floor. Tristan stood at the head of the table and spoke for 4 minutes. He played the recording from the study, read Vincent Graziano's statement aloud, and placed a thick file on the table documenting 12 years of Adrian Sabatini's private dealings with the Rinaldi family. Then he said he was turning the entire file over to the United States Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of New York through an intermediary defense attorney. The entire room objected. Someone stood up. Someone said it had never been done before, that it went against everything his father had built, that handing one of their own over to them would open a door that could never be closed again. Tristan let them finish. He didn't argue a single word. When the room finally fell silent, he said only one sentence. My father died because of our laws. I'll let him live under theirs. No one changed his mind, because in 15 years no one had ever changed his mind once. Vincent Graziano was quietly retired and relocated to a quiet town upstate under a new identity, far from the council's reach, while keeping his pension intact. The petition to transfer Paul into protective custody had already been filed by Tristan's attorney at 6 o'clock that morning. The next morning, Delilah was asked to come down to the study. She had showered, had managed 5 hours of sleep, and stood 2 paces from the desk just as she had the last time. Tristan sat behind it. He pointed toward the corner of the room. The plant there was completely dead now. Nearly all the leaves had fallen onto the tile floor, the stem had turned black, and the whole thing leaned against the side of the pot. That plant belonged to my mother. 40 years. It was the only thing in this room I couldn't buy, and couldn't buy again. Someone poured something into it. That person is going to have to take responsibility. Delilah looked at the plant, then she looked down at the floor. She didn't think about saying she didn't know. She didn't think about blaming anyone else. She simply stood there, and in her mind she saw very clearly her mother's face as Helen sat in that plastic chair outside the hospital hallway. I poured it out. It was me. That night I went in to clear the tray and I saw the glass. I thought it was alcohol. I know I don't have the money to replace it, and I never will. But I'll work for you without pay. 3 years. 5 years. However long it takes. I'm only asking you not to put my mother out. Then she raised a hand to her neck and removed the chain. The night before, in the car on the way back from the docks, Tristan himself had repaired the broken clasp with the clumsy fingers of a man who had never done anything like that before, and he had failed twice before finally getting it right. She placed her mother's wedding ring on the wooden desk and pushed it toward him. Take this. It's the most valuable thing I own. Tristan stood. He walked around the desk. He picked up the ring with both hands, but he didn't place it back into hers. He stepped behind her, lifted the chain over her head, and fastened the clasp himself, slowly and carefully, at the exact place he had repaired the night before. Then he told her everything. He told her that he hadn't slept for a single second that night, that he had been awake from beginning to end, hearing everything, feeling everything, that the glass on the desk had never contained alcohol, that what had been dropped into it was the same substance that had killed his father 15 years earlier, that the plant hadn't died because of her. it had died in his place, that he had watched the recording twice, and in a house with 32 people working inside it. The only person who had entered that room without taking anything, without opening the envelope to see what was inside, and who had stopped to bandage the shoulder of a man she had never even spoken to, was her. Delilah stood perfectly still for about 3 seconds. Then she broke down and cried. She cried the tears she hadn't cried at her father's funeral, hadn't cried in the hotel's human resources office 2 years earlier, and hadn't cried through 4 years of sitting on a plastic chair outside the dialysis unit. 11 months later, Helen Whitfield received a kidney transplant. Tristan didn't buy her a kidney, because no one could buy such a thing and he had no intention of trying. He hired a healthcare attorney to review all 4 years of her medical records, and that attorney discovered that not once in those 4 years had Helen ever been referred for a transplant evaluation, even though she had been eligible from the very first year. Her case was corrected. Her waiting time was retroactively restored to the date she had first begun dialysis, and her name returned to the place where it should have been on the list. Delilah returned to nursing school for the spring semester and paid the tuition with her own money. That was the condition she insisted on, and Tristan was the only person in the world who understood why that condition mattered so much to her. Vincent Graziano came to visit once, carrying a young potted plant, and placed it in the exact same corner where the old one had stood. He didn't say anything. No one asked him to. One evening in April, it was the same room and the same leather chair. This time, the person sleeping there was Delilah, a nursing textbook lying face down across her chest. Tristan took the gray wool blanket and laid it over her shoulders. Then he sat in the chair beside her, not vigilant, not calculating, not waiting for anyone to walk through the door. 32 people worked in that house, and every one of them knew who Tristan Castellano was. But only one person had looked at him and seen a human being who was bleeding, instead of a name people were afraid to say aloud. Sometimes changing an entire life doesn't require anything grand. Sometimes all it takes is pulling a blanket over someone's shoulders and choosing, just once, not to open an envelope and look inside. And if you are sitting somewhere in your own life right now, where no one remembers your name, please don't be too quick to believe that you don't matter, because a person's worth has never depended on whether other people call them by name. It lies in the way they treat the person beside them when no one else is watching. If today's story touched something in you, please press the like button, share it with someone you think might need a little warmth right now, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening to new stories together every day. How did this story make you feel? And in your own life, have you ever met someone who showed you kindness at exactly the moment when you no longer dared to expect it? Or have you ever been that person for someone else? Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from deep inside your heart. We wish you and everyone you love good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.